U.S. Poet Laureate Rita Dove addresses the National Press Club. That's the C-SPAN 2 program schedule. Next, it's a discussion on the development of the Central Intelligence Agency in the Truman administration. This session focuses on the years 1947 to 1953. Former CIA Director Richard Helms is among the participants.
The two sessions this morning go under the general heading of CIA at Work 1947 to 1953, which I presume is as broad and general a title as we could possibly have found, and therefore almost anything could be, and I trust will be, presented. The first panel this morning has the subtitle Espionage and Covert Action, and we shall hear first from a man who clearly does not need any introduction in this audience, Ambassador and former Director of Central Intelligence Richard Helms. The second speaker will be John Ranelagh, who holds degrees from Christ Church, Oxford, and the University of Kent, has written a number of books, is most recently involved in television documentaries, the author of The Agency, The Rise and Decline of the CIA, and a 6-part television documentary in preparation entitled CIA. Ambassador Helms, you have the floor.
Good morning. I didn't realize when I was looking into the past at how many companions of the long march since World War II were going to be in my audience this morning. As I look around the room, I can see at least a half a dozen, maybe a dozen, who went every inch of the way, and I'm just amazed at our survivability. I noticed yesterday that there was a great deal of mention from this platform of dates of various developments during President Truman's administration as it applied to the SSU, CIG, CIA, and so forth. Michael Warner, I think, has done an admirable job in the book that you have of writing a preface which has in it everything anybody needs to know about this subject. And so in my remarks, I don't intend to deal with any dates. You can put the dates in for yourself. I wanted to deal more this morning with the atmosphere that existed in the town at the time that we're discussing the SSU, CIG, CIA period. The SSU people, which was the group that was picked up by CIG and then came into CIA at its founding, were housed in 4 temporary buildings along the reflecting pool underneath the Lincoln Memorial. Ugly buildings, which were hot in the summer and cold in the winter. Cramped quarters if I've ever seen them. Who was occupying these buildings? Survivors of World War II, some from the military, some from the OSS, and a very diverse group indeed. We all seem to forget that in World War II, if you had come to the United States and joined the American military, you could very rapidly become an American citizen. So we had working with us some individuals that hardly knew the English language, and yet they were extremely valuable in the period that followed in Europe, in Asia, and other places. Also, during the OSS days, a great effort had been made to recruit linguists from various parts of the country. And as every historian here knows, Americans are not famous for their linguistic abilities. They rather speak English somehow. But we had discovered that the Mormon missionaries were a great treasure trove of linguistic ability, and we had been successful, obviously, during the war in recruiting many of them. Now, the other part of the atmosphere that is important to remember is that anybody who had on a uniform after 1945 was trying to get out of it. Now, that obviously didn't apply to the regular officers and enlisted men of the military, but after all, this was a pretty much of an Army, Navy, and Air Force manned, at least numerically, by civilians. And they were all getting their numbers and trying to get out just as fast as they could. So the idea of trying to keep together a band or a representative group of intelligence officers to man something that nobody had anticipated would ever have any need to exist was considerable. And we had all of the problems of an intelligence organization to resolve. Yes, we'd inherited these things from the OSS, but what underpinning did they have in our government? They had almost none. After all, the OSS was a figment of Donovan's imagination, which President Roosevelt, by an executive order, put into existence. The SSU was just some sort of a dangly thing that was put together with the sealing wax and paper, and part of it was passed off to the State Department as sort of a, here's something nice for you, and the rest was put in the War Department, and there wasn't a one of us that ever got near the Pentagon. Now, there was one very fortunate thing that happened, and I think this is good to remember. By some extraordinary good fortune, the SSU-CIG group had as his first two bosses General John Magruder and Colonel William W. Quinn. These names seem to have receded into history, if you like, but Bill Quinn is still very much alive, well over 80, but still hearty. But they both were very keen intelligence officers in the United States Army, and they fought a very good battle to keep us together, to keep the praying mantis from consuming us, and from the other aspects of Washington, where the carnivorous appetite of chewing up something that's not well protected is famous. Everybody knows. But somehow or other, they managed to keep this boat afloat. Now, one of the problems that came up, and rather severely early on, was that it was decided to take Latin American intelligence away from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, who had had it during World War II, and give it to the SSU. This enraged Mr. J. Edgar Hoover. But since it was a presidential order that he had to give it up, he certainly gave it up, but grudgingly. So when the SSU took over Latin America as a responsibility, they went to the FBI offices in the various capitals and found out that every scrap of paper of any kind had been taken back to Washington by the FBI, and there was nothing there. There was no repository of the things that the FBI had been able to achieve during World War II, or any of their contacts or knowledge of the area. So this was a rather tough job to suddenly take on with a slightly battered group of real stalwarts. Now, at that point, we obviously had to look around to find some people that knew something about Latin America, and we were successful in recruiting some of the FBI agents who had worked down there. One of these agents I remember particularly educated us, particularly me, in how Mr. Hoover had become probably the most successful bureaucratic manager in the history of the United States. And I will share this with you. I don't know how many of you have read books about Mr. Hoover, but I can assure you he never went around in high heels. But he figured out early on that the sensible thing for a director to do was to be sure that he was in charge of three things. First, there was a division of the Bureau known as Crime Records, which was nothing but a public relations outfit. That reported directly to Mr. Hoover. The second thing was that every congressional aspect reported directly to Mr. Hoover, and the agents who had work on Capitol Hill wrote their reports for him, and they went directly to him. And the third thing was liaison with the elements of the executive branch of the United States government. This even included the White House. In other words, Mr. Hoover was not going to have any liaison officers from the White House or State or Defense or CIA or any place else come and liaise on his office territory. His people went to their office. The net result of this was that every report that every one of those liaison officers wrote went directly to Mr. Hoover. Therefore, he had in his hands every day of the year exactly what was going on around town, who was doing what they were saying about the Bureau, and so forth. And you all know, because there aren't very many children in this audience, that the FBI in his day ran the best public relations programs on the radio and later on the television, the movies that you can imagine. I mean, they were really captivating. Now, this means that from the very start, the agency and the Bureau did not have exactly what you would call a connubial relationship, or conjugal, or anything else. But it was finally worked out over the years as to how we were going to proceed. And with its ups and its downs, I think probably the country was pretty well served. But there was nothing that was going to happen that we could do in the agency to make Mr. Hoover happy about the fact that he didn't like the existence of the agency in the first place. He didn't like its people in the second. And as far as he was concerned, it was quite unnecessary. All you needed was the Bureau. I've never known a man who was quite as successful as keeping his hand in your pocket as he was. He was constantly pushing for this or for that or for the other thing. Now, let's not demean the Bureau. They do an extraordinarily good job. But their culture is very different from that of the CIA or of any of its predecessors. And it's very hard for the two to communicate sometimes on a problem which is very sensitive either to one or to the other. I remember in the 50s, we were very able to find out about a man and a woman who came to the United States as illegal Soviet agents. Since the counterintelligence responsibility of the two organizations ended at the continental limits of the United States, we turned this case over to the Bureau, obviously, so that they would meet the people when they arrived. They botched it up so badly that the duo fled back to Germany before they even found a permanent residence. I don't mention that as being symptomatic of anything except the fact that there was a lot to complain about on both sides. And so when I read in the paper now about the difficulties over the Ames case, none of this surprises me at all. With all the love and affection between directors of the two organizations, that has very little to do with the fellows that have to do the work every day of the week. I'd like also at this point to talk a little bit about counterintelligence. This term has been so abused that I don't think that many people really understand anything about it except what's in the dictionary, which means that it's an entity, a spirit, an effort, call it what you will, to try and keep foreign agents from penetrating the organs of the executive branch of the United States government. But playing the game of counterintelligence turns out to be very dicey indeed. Now, I don't belong to the school that thinks it's a wilderness of mirrors. This rather catchy title, which I don't know, it was attributed to Jim Angleton. I don't know whether he ever used that title or not. But it's quite possible to get so wound up in this thing that you never come out at the end. It's like the Hampton Court maze. But on the other hand, there is no conceivable way that one can make laws, regulations, do training, anything that you like, to ensure that you're never going to be penetrated. We might as well take that as a given right now. There is no way that this can be done. You can put up barriers, you can have badges, you can examine bank accounts, you can stand on your head, you can take polygraph tests, you can do anything you like. But every once in a while, a fish is going to swim through the net. And one might as well recognize that as a fact of life. Now, why don't we catch these people quicker? Why aren't the means of doing this, etc.? Well, nobody's discovered what those means are or what they were. But counterintelligence in the agency started off with two individuals of very different character, very different appearance, very different attitudes in these early days of President Truman's administration. One of them was a fellow named William Harvey, who came to us from the FBI because he had somehow or other gotten into Mr. Hoover's black book, not seriously, but enough so that Mr. Hoover began to transfer him to places he didn't want to go, so he joined the agency. But his job in the Bureau had been that of dealing with Russian agents in the United States during World War II. He ran the Elizabeth Bentley case and several others. And he was thoroughly up to date on what the Bureau had in this general field. It was all in his head. He was one of these fellows with an absolutely fascinating memory that when he would describe the Bentley case to you, he'd give you the address, the time, the moment, everything, just right off his head. He would sit there by the hour and talk about it. The other one involved was James Angleton, whose name is much more familiar because he stayed with the agency a lot longer. He was trained by the British in World War II, ran double agents in Italy for the last year of the war in conjunction with the British, and brought a very real sense of how counterintelligence should be run to the agency. So between the two of them, gradually, we began to develop a counterintelligence approach. And the answer to whether it was successful or not is that the agency was certainly not penetrated at any level that made any significant difference until very much later. And I think after Angleton had left. He has been much abused by two books that have been written. I don't mean to go into that at any great length, but I think that there's a time when a little balance in some of these things might be desirable, and I know there are people that dislike him intensely. Now here we have two fellows, Angleton, spare, hunched over, academic looking, a poet, and Harvey with a big belly, right out of the cornfields of Indiana, guns on his hip, swaggering. But between the two of them, they somehow had this one thing in common, and that was how to keep Russians from penetrating the United States government. And they were damn good at the job, and they got this lore going. Now, you're going to hear a lot about this before the Ames case is finished. But please keep in mind what I said, that whatever they come up with, it's not going to be foolproof. There may be certain improvements that can be made, but it's an attitudinal thing. And all you have to do is convince a group that it's not very nice to be spying on your fellow colleague because you have to trust him when you're in the field. I pause because that's the way it has to work. It makes it a very difficult thing for the members of the agency to handle, or for the members of any community to handle. And don't let us start pointing fingers in various directions as one is worse than the other. After all, the foreign services had their spies, and the FBI has had its spies, and NSA has had its spies, and so forth over time. So although the Ames case may be big at the moment, it will simply take its place with some of the more serious ones that we've had since World War II. Covert action. George Kennan, who is a name I'm sure known to all of you, is really the man responsible for the establishment of what was known as the Office of Policy Coordination, and which was the one endowed with the right to do covert action. And it was President Truman, whom you will all remember from yesterday, was the one who got them started. For a time, OSO and OPC had a difficult time working together. Two separate organizations, both in the CIA, both operating overseas, and with a tendency to compete for agents, for networks, for liaison relationships, for relations with the State Department. In many respects, it was a nightmare. The OSO was small. OPC was getting larger by the moment. When the Korean War came along, it really exploded. The OSO people felt that the OPC people were a bunch of cowboys, that they were the professionals, and that these fellows were simply running around making life difficult overseas. When General Smith wised up to all this and looked at the administrative problem he had of putting some general like General Truscott in Germany in charge of these two competing organizations, he recognized pretty quickly that he had a nightmare on his hands. So it was he who decided to merge the two organizations. Now that was not an easy thing to do, and there was lots of turf warfare, and there was lots of undercutting. But, strangely enough, this came off rather well within a year or two, and then we had what I think was a much more harder hitting organization, which was tied together, shared experiences, and above all, did not compete with each other for the few good agents that were around. Congressional relations. The early days of the agency, as far as Capitol Hill were concerned, can only be described as halcyon. We reported to 4 committees of the Congress. Armed Services in the Senate and House had the oversight, but obviously one had to also report to the appropriations committees. The appropriations chairman in the House when we started out was Clarence Cannon, who used to have the hearings, the agency's budget, with just 2 or 3 other representatives present, then would end the session by pointing out very carefully to the director that he should not go around talking to a lot of congressmen because they leaked all the time, that he would take care of the budget and not to worry about it, that secrecy was all important in this kind of activity. The same situation existed in the Senate. The contrast is rather marked. In the Senate, there was finally one committee composed of the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, and about 4 other senators. That was it. One staffer. Today, for the Senate Select Committee, there are 50 staffers. In the House, the Appropriations Subcommittee had 1 staffer, and the Armed Services Committee had 1 staffer. That was it. We had hearings. The budget was never hidden from the Congress, as has been charged. It was laid out in minute detail for these gentlemen to examine. But that was back in the days when powerful committee chairmen ran both houses of Congress. They felt that this fledgling organization deserved a chance to get going. The Cold War was ominous, and they were behind it. So when 1975 came along and all these secrets were suddenly pulled out by the Church Committee, there were a lot of people in the intelligence work who felt that they had been betrayed, in the sense that what the hell was this all about? We'd always been assured these secrets were going to be kept. But since I heard this with my own ears, this business about secrecy, I share it with you, not to make any particular point, because in a democracy things can change overnight, but simply to tell you the way the atmosphere was in those days. I forgot to mention when talking about Harvey and Angleton that they were the ones who fingered Philby. In 1951, Harvey came up with the fact that Philby was probably a mole, which incidentally, for those of you who are not familiar with the vernacular of intelligence, is a term that was invented by John le Carré. It had no standing in intelligence until he started writing his books. Now, one other point I want to make, and then I will quit. During this period, we had to take over the entire intelligence apparatus of the German Wehrmacht, which had been working on the Soviet Union. It was called the Fremde Heere Ost. This was quite a trick. The Army took this over after VE Day, ran it for a time, but it was recognized in the Pentagon that this was probably not the greatest idea for the United States Army to have on its TO. And after much negotiation and talk back and forth, the whole affair was transferred to the agency. This was obviously a chore of no small proportions, but somehow or other we got it done and began to control, and for many years, in effect, ran this organization. The difficulties here, of course, you can imagine. We had certain aims. The Germans had certain other aims. They were proud. These were fine officers of the Wehrmacht, and it was not an easy job. But somehow, it was contained, it never exploded, and turned out to be very useful in the end. As far as his Russian operations were concerned in these days, they were run almost entirely from the Berlin base. We had nobody in Moscow. We had no overhead reconnaissance. Occasionally a defector would come along providing useful information. But it's hard to imagine the blank these days was that vast continent then known as the Soviet Union, with various military operations coming forward, showing up here. We had no idea of quantities, contents. Gradually, one by one, we got agents called Popov and Penkovsky who contributed enormous amounts of information, but that was not satisfactory. And it was not until we developed various kinds of overhead reconnaissance for which the agency can take full credit. The U-2, the SR-71, Now that's something interesting. The SR-71, or Oxcart as it was known in the CIA version, was flying in early 1963. To this day, it's the highest performance aircraft in the United States Air Force. No aircraft has been built since that anywhere near attains what this one could do. Flying at 90,000 feet, 3 times the speed, Mach 3, fly across from Orlando, Florida to Los Angeles, California in an hour and 10 minutes. I think it's fair to say in closing that when General Smith and Allen Dulles took over at the agency, things really started to happen. Now, that is not my brief this morning to talk about that, but between the two of them, unlikely people to be working on a common enterprise, but nevertheless, they got along reasonably well. This is when the spirit picked up, when things began to really get tightly organized, and the agency took off for the ensuing period of the Cold War. I want to conclude this talk by observing that since I was privileged to be present at the onset of the Cold War, as well as at its conclusion, I would like to voice the hope that we can do as good a job of dismantling its particular apparatus as President Truman did of constructing it in the first place. Transition periods like the one we're in, transition periods in a democracy have a tendency to be somewhat disorderly, since public opinion is diffuse, diverse, and divided. Where do we want to head? And how do we get there? But one consideration should be kept in mind, and firmly so. Great technological breakthroughs spawned by the urgency of war, hot or cold, do not have behind them the same driving force in peacetime. Therefore, let us be careful not to destroy what we already have by an excess of zeal to return to budgets dedicated solely to social issues. Today, I am thinking particularly of the marvelous photographic satellites devised and designed by a scientist of the Central Intelligence Agency. Such inventions may not have been part of Mr. Truman's dream for the CIA he founded, but they turned out to be the solution to the paramount intelligence enigma of the Cold War: Soviet military strength and what it entailed. They still serve an essential intelligence purpose today and every day, and they will for long times to come. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I shall be echoing quite a lot, I think, of what we've heard from Dick Helms and some of what we heard yesterday. But what I'm going to try to do is put some sort of historical perspective on the period 47-52, the Truman presidency era of the CIA. David McCullough, in his biography of Truman, mentions the agency 5 times in 992 pages. He concludes, as Chris Andrew reminded us, that Truman never expected the CIA to become what it did. I should say right away that it is doubtful if Truman or anyone else had any clear idea of how the CIA would turn out in the late 1940s. Great institutions work out their own destinies in relations to the societies that surround and supply them. Espionage and operations, for example, took time to gear up, so it is not surprising that people might have been surprised by later activity in those areas. It took time because America had not yet worked out how it would conduct the Cold War and did not want to imagine itself doing so. I think, therefore, it's worth having a look at the nature of the age when the CIA came into being. 1945 to 1950 was a period of particular tension, both about the immediate present and the future. On the 3rd of November 1947, John G. Wynant, who had been ambassador to Britain during the war, committed suicide in general despair at the future of the world. On that day, Lenin's seizure of power in 1917 was closer in time than John F. Kennedy's assassination is to us today. Wynant was followed 16 months later by Jim Forrestal, who committed suicide for similar reasons. A band of savage and cranky conspirators who had seized Russia looked as if they were taking over the world. With the Korean War, the age was simultaneously defined as Soviet-American polarization and was so institutionalized for the next 40 years until the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, at the moment of the agency's coming into being in 1947, nobody knew what shape it would have because nobody knew the shape the unformed world would actually have. At the highest levels in Washington, for example, it was thought that a third world war might actually break out. 1952 was considered to be the most likely year for this to happen. There's the famous telegram from Lucius Clay in Germany, 5th of March 1948, to give a date. Then he declared that he thought that war with the Soviets might come with dramatic suddenness. 11 days later, the young CIA said in an estimate that it did not think that war would start within the next 60 days. Early agency reports and estimates are peppered with headings such as assessment of a country's war potential and preparedness for war. The level of tension implicit in General Clay's expectations and the agency's principal analytical concerns simply reflected the period. The Korean War finally conditioned and began giving clear shape to the age. So we have two stages, the creation period from 1945 and then the shaping period beginning in 1950 with the Korean War. First, the creation period. There was a great sense of rethinking America's place in the world after 1945. In 1947, the agency was formed in what amounted to a second industrial revolution, where developments were accelerated. In the previous 10 years, radar, the jet engine, supersonic aircraft and supersonic guided missiles, the atom bomb, intercontinental aircraft and rockets, the backpack radio, plastic, photocopiers, nylon, computers had all come into being. Immediate past history was all defining. The Russian Revolution of 1917, more accurately a coup d'etat, had brought home the significance of long-range covert penetration, subversion, and organization. The mindset of politicians and of the people who formed the agency was shaped by their experience in World War II, most directly by the shock of Pearl Harbor. The 1939 Nazi-Soviet pact also had a devastating impact on this first national intelligence generation, and they sought not to repeat American habits of improvisation and instead carefully to plan responses. A high proportion of young agency people had taken heavy personal risks during the war. They knew horror. Espionage and operations to keep peace seemed an infinitely preferable alternative. Into the early 1950s, it was not clear that containment would succeed. But to these young men and women, intelligence was akin to Lawrence of Arabia type work in the developed world. Brave, sophisticated, and above all, economical of life. No more Pearl Harbors was the cry after 1945, and was at the heart of the planning and establishment of the CIA as an agency of armed peace. World War II had seen the United States encounter totalitarianism without real mastery of intelligence. It was followed immediately by a new world of permanent struggle, with no clear limits and unknown, but rightly feared, consequences attaching to actions large and small. For almost 2 years after the end of the war, communists shared power in Belgium, France, and Italy. Communist parties in the West received not-so-secret Soviet funding. Strikes on the Marseille waterfront and at Italian food depots that mushroomed in 1946, guerrilla movements in Greece, Malaya, the Philippines, Vietnam, Indochina, the independence of India, the creation of Pakistan and medieval-like religious war that followed, China falling to the communists, Whittaker Chambers' testimony implicating Alger Hiss and others in a red American underground, murderous conflict in the dark alleys of Berlin, Jan Masaryk thrown from a window to his death by communist secret police in Czechoslovakia in 1948. All looked with justice to be foaming surface traces of a great red shark racing to attack underneath. In Europe, by the end of 1947, about 116 million people and about 577,000 square miles were either under Soviet occupation, had Soviet-controlled governments, or had been incorporated in the Soviet Union since 1939. It was clear that a completely new experience faced the war's undamaged country, America, and that only America could act to withstand red imperialism. What to do and how to do it were the operating questions. The maps had not been drawn. No one had written the book on ideological war. The great game had moved outward from Central Asia to Central Europe, and America had never played the great game before. It had neither the desire nor the people to be involved in the colossal civil war in China in the 1940s. Its policy had been to keep out of the entanglements of alliance systems. Now it found itself in alliance with allies of dubious background, stability, and purpose. The United States under Truman had inherited every enemy the Soviets had. After all, there was no one else but America to turn to after 1945. The Soviets had intense and extensive experience of dirty work, and to the present, and America did not, and to the present day finds it very hard to accept anything that smacks of it. But Truman found that willy-nilly his country was involved and that some strategic direction and control was necessary. Truman felt the only way to learn was by doing, so he did. He sought resolution in cool action rather than some great theoretical scheme. Early Cold War experience, together with the obvious contraction of British power, showed him clearly that a central intelligence agency, coupled to coordinated national security policymaking and objectives, was an essential step to take. Thoughtful people, not least Truman himself, were trying to put systems in place that would, at the least, enable the United States to be better prepared to contain shocks and changes in less response time. From 1945 to 1947, these preparations themselves affected the shape that was to come. New Deal experience at home was applied to the foreign front. It was a time, therefore, of great institutional incubation. But institutions are set up to handle the preoccupations of the people who set them up, and it is instructive, therefore, to look at what was being done. The Defense Department, National Security Council, the CIA, Atomic Energy Commission, Air Force, Joint Chiefs of Staff, policy planning at state were all being planned and formed. Centralization and gearing for the struggle with the Soviets was the double helix that bound the new organizations together. If it wasn't for Mort Halperin, the term national security state would be a proper description of this phase. It was, after all, a time of crisis, and what's wrong with emphasizing national security in a crisis? There were, behind this as well, appalling Army, Navy, Air Force fights in the 1940s that cost one Secretary of Defense and one Chief of Naval Operations their jobs. When you read Curtis LeMay's autobiography, it becomes apparent that his real feeling was not against the Germans or the Japanese or the Russians, but against the Navy. The CIA's creators, beginning in many ways with Bill Donovan and the OSS veterans, fought for an agency that would be above intra-service conflict, that would be the president's and not the brass's, and that could concentrate all intelligence information so as explicitly to forestall another Pearl Harbor. They set about creating a declared civilian, permanent, worldwide, large-scale, comprehensive intelligence agency that came into being in 1947 with an elite talent pool, a point I shall come back to, and designed to speak at the top table with the Director of Central Intelligence functionally at cabinet level when cabinet level meant something. Congress's role should not be underestimated either. In 1946, the House rejected a proposal to spend $1 million on cancer research, but a year later it was perfectly willing to spend tens of millions establishing the agency. The understanding in relationships, as Dick Helms has reminded us, that then inhabited Congress produced the votes, the law, and the funds. This would probably be impossible to achieve today. The part that Truman played was of enormous importance. He was far more important at the beginning than at the end. His conviction and drive made much of the institutionalizing happen. Decisive action is never taken by committees. It was Truman. There was no surrogate for the man in the White House in 1947. He was the only official who could make the decision to confront the Soviets to some degree on their own ground, and that decision is what the agency represented. Eisenhower, in contrast, might well have rejected the agency, reasoning that it would be better to avoid fights that could easily be lost. Truman was the first president since Harding to come from Congress, and Congress was not beating at him. But in 1946, the 80th Congress had come in with a strong Republican majority, and there was a sense that the political tide was running against Truman and the Democrats. Political observers assumed that Truman would not win the 1948 election, that there would be a Republican president, and a return to a 1919-like situation with tariffs and a focus on Asia. The Republicans wanted a voice. Republicans had been in a minority for 15 years, and so did Congress as a whole. The do-nothing, good-for-nothing 80th Congress, Truman called it. Congress had been left out of foreign policy making and some of the most significant decisions of US government since before Pearl Harbor. No senator or representative, for example, had really known that they had voted for the Manhattan Project. The 1947 National Security Act, creating the agency, the National Security Council, and the Defense Department, was a gesture to Congress, which was being told who was in charge and was being involved in defining who should be in charge. At the same time, Congress was encouraged to reorganize the presidential succession with the 1947 Succession Act. The Speaker of the House was now placed after the Vice President in order of succession. From 1886 to 1947, the Secretary of State and the whole Cabinet had stood between the Speaker and the Presidency. Congressional vanity was being placated. Military intelligence, of course, has always been part of the framework. It's automatic. The struggle at this time was to gain political and military acceptance of an addition to military intelligence, giving the "no more Pearl Harbors" cry added potency. Pearl Harbor had been a failure of military intelligence. But after 1945, it was a cold, not a hot war that was being fought, the kind of conflict that military intelligence is simply not set up to do. It needed political types to fight it. From the start, despite appointments from the military, DCIs, with the exception of Hillenkoetter, were political. Putting to work in peacetime the special OSS skills was the addition to the military intelligence framework that they achieved. The skills of political analysis and micro-operational experience. In securing this achievement, combating military influence on the Hill was the first success of the OSS veterans. Maintaining momentum so that the CIA was established and maintained was their second. Their compromise was actively to seek not to attract the attention of or interference from the military, thus too the military ranks that adorned each DCI under Truman. But the idea of the Director of Central Intelligence as the overall coordinator of intelligence was a dead letter before it began. The generals and admirals won that one. All the civilians on the sidelines could not bring about a central unity. In placating the military, the agency's founding generation was again successful. Espionage and operations were always the areas that the military and politicians would be most sensitive about. So OSO in the agency was quiet and sophisticated. OPC, in contrast, formed under state auspices, collected many of the gung-ho types that drew attention and campaigned for operations. They were to come into their own after 1950. They reflected both Truman's temperament, treading on people's toes if they were trying to tread on his, and the American desire to do something. So now I turn to the second phase of the Truman years, namely the shaping period, ushered in by the Korean War in 1950. At its start, the agency was more of a covert action organization than an espionage one. This is a difficult point to press, since the two went very much together at the time. Technical intelligence was important and significant. It inherited the wartime achievements of Magic and Ultra, but it was not employing a large number of people, and its output was not voluminous. While Truman was impressed by communications intelligence, one of his last acts as president was to create the National Security Agency, Intelligence in the Truman years was still a warm body activity. The great technical breakthrough was Carl Nelson's achievement in the Office of Communications in 1950, when he broke the Soviet cipher encoding process. But it was not really until the development of the U-2, just outside our span, that what had been an espionage famine became a feast. This was because technical intelligence was not so advanced in the early years, and this meant that the Soviets, the Red Chinese, the North Koreans, and so on, were less known. Consequently, there were more Pearl Harbors, notably the North Korean attack on the South in 1950, which was predicted by no one. It was too close a parallel. An enemy had massed its forces and launched a surprise attack without the United States being prepared. It dictated change. The change was Beadle Smith. His appointment as DCI in October 1950 marked a fundamental shift in the importance of the agency and in its bureaucratic clout. In turn, this represented a clarification of Truman's mind. General Smith was the first absolutely first-class staff officer to be DCI. He enjoyed the confidence of the civilian and military leadership at the highest levels. Cold War, espionage, subversion, containing conflict in Korea needed political types, and this had also called for Smith as a new kind of intelligence chief. He had politico-military experience second only to Eisenhower's of running a great alliance war. With Smith, the agency had the director who put it unmistakably at the top table and gave it the force to fend off state and the Pentagon. The clarification of Truman's mind, which prompted Smith's appointment, was in step with the reality that Korea represented. As the early 1950s unfolded, it was clear that the chances of direct as opposed to indirect conflict were less and less, and that the secret world would register most of the indirect conflict. Thus, Truman considered it was suitable and safe to promote intelligence and support secret conflict, secret in that it was kept from Americans. It sure as hell wasn't kept from the Soviet leadership. And this is where the move began towards operations. The Korean War argued that the Soviet Union was not going to launch a direct attack, and that direct conflicts could be limited and contained, if only at the cost of Douglas MacArthur's career. Of course, there had been operations before. They actually began with OSO in Yugoslavia, Italy, and France, and Germany, and so on, and not with OPC. But OPC believed wholeheartedly in them. On one occasion, in the fall of 1950, for example, OPC officers fired live rounds at and kidnapped OSO people in Bangkok. The OSO guys had established that the radio operator of Lee Mee's forces, Harold Ford spoke about some of this yesterday, was a red agent, which explained why every foray into China was being ambushed. Lee Mee was an OPC operation, and the OPC people were violently reluctant to admit that it was penetrated. They thought that if they could keep OSO's discovery quiet by kidnapping the two OSO radio operators and so prevent news being sent back to Washington, that would give them time to build a cover story that would reflect badly upon OPC security and vetting procedures. The news still got back. The remaining OSO agents knew how to use a radio as well. As I have already indicated, covert actions carried more weight at home than espionage at this point. Espionage had not penetrated Moscow, had not forewarned about North Korea's and subsequently Red China's plans. And the Korean War early on showed that Cold War might be a hot contest between two secret networks. I mentioned earlier the elite pool that the agency drew from at its start. It should not be overstressed, but it should be noted. The elite and wealthy families that sprinkled Donovan's OSS lent their gloss to the CIA, taking the curse off secrecy. Traditionally, intelligence services tend to be in the hands of oddballs. The necessary paranoia of the profession pushes towards this. But by placing intelligence in the hands of people with a solid stake in the Republic, the creators of the agency averted much oddballism. A strong magnet for the elites, especially intellectual ones, was that the agency and America were engaged in a struggle for the world. There was an enormous and exaggerated sense of the power of social and behavioral science, where new experts and new subjects mushroomed daily. The CIA represented a vision of the management of information, which was a contemporary social science dream. It developed social science intelligence, itself a follow-through from the OSS. Incorporating analysis was the most unusual aspect of the agency in the early period and is a unique American contribution to intelligence organizations generally. The agency could and did reject military analysis from the Pentagon that it deemed inadequate, which was a real test of its power and authority. The unsung Hillenkoetter deserves particular tribute on this score. It did not stop the military getting their views across, but the agency and the DCI could prevent the central stamp being put on them. All this in turn acted to advance intellectuals. The idea of a world struggle was an intellectual way of looking at events. That there was a real struggle of ideas and ideology enhanced this, and the agency, in its early analytical emphasis, locked in people with an intellectual perspective. Journalists with claims to reflective interests, like the Alsop brothers, saw the struggle with the Soviets in ideological terms, and were agency channels to a wider world. Tom Braden, that unlikely ambassador of the International Organizations Division of the Directorate of Plans, once said to me, "We had a vast project targeted on the intellectuals, the battle for Picasso's mind, if you will. The communists set up fronts which effectively enticed a great many, particularly French intellectuals, to join. We tried to set up a counterfront. The radios, support for the National Student Association, the International Student Conference, the Congress of Cultural Freedom, for Encounter Monat Preuves was the result. The whole operation was an entirely natural reflection of elite sensibilities, and if I may say, probably one of the most effective and long-lasting ones that the agency has ever conducted." So, to sum up, when the agency came into existence, its job was the struggle for the world. It was seen by contemporaries as a clearinghouse. And it is worth noting that in the decades that followed, the Soviets always attacked the agency for its subversion, not its espionage. To outsiders, covert operations were to become the agency's defining activity. Second, Truman was not a philosopher. He was a problem solver. He was clear about what he did, and despite his subsequent hesitancy to acknowledge the logic of some of his actions, operations were in tune with his temperament. He was motivated by immediate practical concerns and did not scan the far horizons. He signed off on the agency because he and the country needed it. Third, the agency was a creature of its age. Immediate past history of subversion, surprise attack, and war was crucial to its nature. The experience and mindset of the veterans of the OSS who campaigned for a centralized peacetime civilian agency had a direct bearing. A great tribute to the agency's leadership over the decades is the way that it has changed, most importantly in the 1970s, moderating itself, finding a place for secrecy in the democracy. Fourth, the Korean War forced a clarification in Truman's mind that resulted in Beadle-Smith's appointment and the agency having real clout in Washington. It also resulted in an acceptance that the Cold War would in part be a secret struggle between secret organizations, and this in turn spawned operations. Today, as Dick Helms has reminded us, we are at what bids fair to be another dividing gap, not the end of history, but another phase, just like the late 1940s. We do not today have a new world order. We have another interim period during which we have to make up our minds about what kind of world we are seeking and what kind of world we are really likely to face. There are, of course, differences between then and now. America, for example, is relatively less powerful than it was 45 years ago. But the most important contrast is one of attitudes. In his farewell speech to the agency in 1952, Truman said, "We are at the top and the leader of the free world, something that we did not anticipate, something that we did not want, but something that has been forced upon us." Today, America is fundamentally bored with being a world power, although, just as before, it is still the most authentically great one. Thank you.
Questions?
I'm Richard Kaufman with the Woodrow Wilson Center. I wonder if Mr. Helms would elaborate a little bit on George F. Kennan's role and whether he acted in an official capacity. Did he ever serve as a consultant to the agency, or was he doing this just as an insider from the State Department?
My recollection is, and I think that John Gaddis, his biographer, can probably answer this more accurately, but my recollection of the time is that as director of the newly founded State Department Policy Planning Staff, Kennan and various others who were familiar with the Soviet Union and James Forrestal all got together and decided that something had to be done about what looked very much like a Russian takeover of Europe. Yesterday, the points were made about communist labor in France, communist labor in Italy, all of the front organizations being run by the international communist apparatus. And it was Kennan, I believe, who came up with the idea that there should be an entity in our government that was going to combat this affront, and what is more, would combat it in such a way that it would be in keeping with decent principles of the West. And as anybody will tell you who examines the front organizations that the agency subsequently established under Tom Braden and Cord Meyer, they were most of them composed of the non-communist left.
Robert Heibel, Mercyhurst College. I believe I'm the only ex-FBI agent in the group here. And I'm a student of the SIS, the FBI's endeavors in the Western Hemisphere during World War II. And I wonder perhaps if the Bureau's withdrawing of its documents from Latin America was not perhaps a response to a concern they had for the security of the sources and methods that they had developed in Latin America during the period that they were there. If you recall, there were people in the State Department, such as Lawrence Duggan, during that period, who was a very high-ranking official in Latin America. I'd like your opinion on it, whether or not you think it was a matter of spite, or perhaps the Bureau was attempting to protect the people that had cooperated with it during World War II.
I don't think there's any doubt that it may have been a mix. I think the interpretation that you put on it, if I may be so bold, is it's sort of the sweetheart kiss as far as the problem was concerned. This was Mr. Hoover's excuse. But I think there were many ways in which they could have eased the transition by helping out the individuals who were sent down to take over. And I must say that I never, during that period of time, saw any effort on the part of the Bureau to make this easy at all. So that may have been the excuse given. Maybe it could have been sustained at the time. There were certainly Soviet penetrations of the administration in Washington, and there may have been these security considerations. I have no doubt they were. But I only want to say to you that the impression given to us by the FBI agents who came to work for us and so forth was that Mr. Hoover was pretty cold-hearted about the whole thing.
I'm Tom Powers, and I've got a question for Ambassador Helms, as so often. You said that you were privileged to be at the beginning of the Cold War and there again at the end. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about what you expected at the beginning. How did you think it would end and what course it would take? How did the world look to you personally at that time?
That is something about which I haven't thought for some years. I frankly think that my own perception of it was that the United States and the West was beleaguered. Why was it that we had that impression? The Yalta Conference, which theoretically ended on a perfectly satisfactory note, turned out in the end to be a disaster. Central Europe simply fell to the Russians. They took it over. The threats in Western Europe were not only real, they were dynamic. After all, when one looks back to that period, we all recognize that one of the most useful undergrounds during World War II in France had been the Communist Party's underground. And they were the ones that came to the fore as soon as the war was over and wanted to take over not only the French labor unions, but the French government. And so my thoughts were that at that time, everything was almost entirely defensive. How are we going to cope with this, and how are we going to deal with these various problems, and what were the mechanisms that we could have at our disposal? Now, as far as I personally am concerned, all my associates, and there are many of them here in the room, know that I was not the most creative fellow in the world. So I don't think that they would have accused me of having a great strategic concept of where this Cold War was going to come out at that time. We were fighting a day-to-day battle, almost literally day by day. And so I have to duck that. If I had any ideas, I don't remember what they were.
If I could ask, sorry, is this on? Yes. This is a question, it's Wesley Warwick, University of Toronto, a question for both Mr. Helms and John Ranelagh. John Ranelagh spoke of the shift from feast to famine with the coming of the U-2 and other more sophisticated technological means of intelligence gathering. We heard yesterday afternoon a counterfactual suggestion, which I found fascinating, that it might have been the case that the Central Intelligence Agency and other members of the U.S. intelligence community should have acquired these kinds of technological means more quickly than they in fact did. And I'd be interested in both gentlemen's comments on whether there was indeed a post-Second World War lag in the acquisition of technological intelligence, and if there was, in either of your senses of this, what the reason for that might have been.
I can only say that if you lived through those days, you would have felt that devising an airplane that was going to fly high enough, take accurate enough photographs, and come back to its starting point was a thought that was in the minds of some of our top scientists. But the actual performance and devising of the aircraft certainly took some time. And I don't care very much at this late date to belong to the what-if school. There are what-ifs every day in this community and in this world. If you'd done this, wouldn't it have been better if you'd done that? And all I can say is that fortunately for all, we got those technological achievements devised and used in plenty of time to handle the problems that we had. I mentioned the defectors. They were most useful at the time. But I also want to correct a certain sensation that I've had in books and magazine articles and so forth, that there was something about the freedom of the West that attracted these Soviet defectors. I only simply want to put a fact before you, and that is of all the defectors we had during the Cold War, I don't know of a single Russian case where the reason for the defection was the desire for freedom. And it's that mentality that you're facing in Russia today when you think they're going to suddenly become Democrats because they want freedom.
Yes. I speak with the tremendous advantage that I wasn't there, and therefore I have great authority. I think, though, that to echo what's been said, that that it's all important to put one's mind back into the cast of mind that was operating at the time, and the whole experience, the public experience, Christopher Andrew has made the point already that the most important experience is signals and communications intelligence with Ultra and Magic and its success. But that was very, very closely held. It was so closely held that many of the people who were making the budgetary decisions and so on weren't particularly aware of it and weren't being asked to put money into technical intelligence projects. The experience had been one of human intelligence, of people being parachuted in, of guerrilla bands, of marching through jungles, of doing daring deeds. And it took time, as it always does, I think, for the penny to drop. Bill Colby was, I think, unnecessarily self-flagellatory yesterday when he acknowledged that he thought that perhaps in retrospect more could have been put into technical intelligence at the time. I don't really think so. I think that what happened is what happened and no more was likely. And what happened was remarkable.
Paul Kreisberg, the Woodrow Wilson Center. Mr. Helms, I wonder if you would give us a sense. I know this is going to be on the agenda for later today, but while we have you here, after 50 years, would you give us a sense of whether there are any or what kinds of operations or activities of the CIA that you feel would not be appropriate to declassify, as one reads the New York Times, the Washington Post today about plans for millions of papers to be declassified? What would you not declassify?
Let me go to what I think is the point of the question. There was a question of whether or not certain documents should be declassified for this conference on operations in France and Italy during the period of President Truman's administration. But there's a very important election coming up in Italy shortly, and it was felt that it would be very undesirable to lay out what the agency had done in Italian elections in the end of the 40s and early 50s. Certainly these things are known to historians. There is no particular secret about them, but all you have to do is launch these papers at this particular time. It'll be headlines all over Italy. There'll be the assumption that we're messing around in Italian politics again, and this is the kind of headache that I think the State Department and the White House don't have to have. So I think this question of declassification not only has to be ad hoc, if you want to put it that way, but there are still certain things that may be known to various of you, and particularly to the historians, but they aren't necessarily things that we need in headlines in the modern context.
Arnold Beichman, the Hoover Institution. Mr. Helms, during the history of the CIA, there were a number of what have been called self-inflicted wounds. That is, exposés by CIA officers in books or magazine articles about the, quote, skullduggery that the CIA had engaged in. Has anybody ever done a damage assessment to see how serious were these exposés in terms of the functioning of the CIA, particularly in the front organizations like the Congress for Cultural Freedom and other activities which were exposed by CIA officers?
I honestly don't know the answer to the question. During my term there, I don't recall any such damage assessments. Whether any took place later, I don't know. But I can only say that certainly those revelations are grist to the mill. Whether they've done anybody any good or not is something else again. But in our form of democracy, a secret organization, or the ones that run secret operations, has a very difficult time of it. You can put up a great wall to protect yourself from foreigners, but we have perfectly good newspapermen in Washington and others who get behind that big curtain that you've put up and live next door to the case officer and all the rest of it, so that it's really amazing that we ever carry anything off secretly. On the other hand, the whole point of the agency was to defend freedom, to defend democracy, and to defend the United States of America, and that's what it's done its best to do. I want to make one particular comment. The agency was criticized in times past for being too rough, for being mean, for doing a lot of things of that kind. You know, during World War II, when a lot of us were trained, winning was everything. There wasn't any question of compromise or anything else in World War II. The Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the OSS and everybody else was out to win the war. And these niceties, which we trumpet these days in our own society, were simply let go. So a bunch of the OSS veterans who came in and others who had served in World War II were all prepared to fight a rough war. And this is what they did in many respects. So that the turn of history made them look nasty, whereas actually this is what they've been trained to do. I will never forget going through the close combat course taught by the British colonel who had trained the British commandos. Now that close combat course was how you kill or maim the enemy. This wasn't how you win a fight or a boxing match or see who won on points or anything of that kind. This was rough. In other words, his counsel was that if you were in a bar and a fight began, you don't pick up the stool to protect yourself. You grab the nearest bottle, break it off on the edge of the bar, and ram the jagged piece into the fellow's face. This was the entire approach. Sneaky if you possible, but when you went into combat, kill them. And I want to say that this is no excuse for maybe some of the excesses at times, but at least it partially explains how they came into being and why they were in the minds of the people who were doing the work.
We have time for one last question, and then we'll take a break.
I'm Douglas Wheeler from the University of New Hampshire. When did the polygraph machine begin? Did it begin in this era? And it seems interesting to note that the British and other nations' intelligence services have not a tradition of using the polygraph machine as much as we do. Does this tell us something about ourselves?
I can't remember when the use of the polygraph began. And since this is such a controversial item, I really don't think this is the forum for me to try and discuss the pros and cons of using a polygraph. So if you'll forgive me, I think I'll duck that one.
I'd like to thank the distinguished panel, and please adjourn to the foyer for some light refreshments.
Next, we continue our coverage of this conference with a discussion on...
Is Professor of Political Science and Director of International Security Policy Studies in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University.